Annie Urbana Culler grew up on her family's farm in the Limestone community, 10 miles northwest of Orangeburg. She and her family were active members of Limestone Methodist Church. She sometimes rode a horse to the school she attended in Limestone. After the 8th grade, she started going to school in Orangeburg and boarded with relatives during the week. It was there she met Albert Chandler Watson II. Albert was born in Ellery, South Carolina. His family moved to Orangeburg when he was 1 year old. He grew up in a large house near the center of town. His family was prominent because his father was a city councilman and a successful businessman. Albert attended the First Baptist Church with his father, while his mother and brother Mike attended St. Paul's Methodist Church in Orangeburg. As a boy, Albert would spend his summer days swimming in the Edisto River.
In those days, after a wonderful breakfast, the boys of the town who could get away got on their bicycles and rode to a landing on the river known as the Old Bridge. Of course, in those days, it was unheard of for girls to be swimming around Orangeburg. So all we had to do in preparation of going in was to remove all of our clothes. And we'd swim and water fight and engage in any other activities that came to mind. And that is the way we spent most of our summer days in those good old days, from the time I was in about the 1st grade on up to high school.
He also worked as a lifeguard at the town swimming pool. Albert was too young to serve in World War I, but his brother Mike and 2 of Annie's brothers served. The war ended before Annie's brothers went overseas. Annie, who began playing the piano when she was 3 years old, was becoming an excellent musician. One of her uncles wanted to send her to the Juilliard School to study music in New York, but Annie didn't want to go that far from home. Instead, she attended Winthrop College for 2 years and commuted on Saturdays for a year to take violin and voice lessons at Columbia College.
When I went to Winthrop College, I took music there and I was in the orchestra.
What did you play in the orchestra?
Violin. And I took music at Columbia College. Well, I could play a guitar just a little bit and ukulele, and did learn the mandolin. But it wasn't much to the little bit I knew about the mandolin.
Albert attended the University of South Carolina for 2 years before transferring to the Georgia Institute of Technology. He majored in accounting, but read his roommate's engineering books for fun. Just before graduating, his father asked him to come home to manage an Orange Crush bottling company that he owned. By the time Albert arrived back in Orangeburg, his father had sold that company. A few months later, his father passed away. It was 1928, and Albert and his brother Mike then took over their father's insurance company and also ran the family farm. Most of the farms of the area were not large enough to support families, so many farmers had some other job to supplement their incomes. Annie Culler was teaching at Limestone School and was the principal. She would walk there from her parents' house where she lived.
I hadn't seen Albert in 2 years, and he came out to Limestone Church one Wednesday night for a prayer meeting to look for Anna Culler, another girl who was very beautiful. And he didn't date Anna another time, because he asked to take me home that night, because Anna was not at prayer meeting. I decided that night I was going to marry him.
Did he feel the same way that night?
No. He said he didn't know anything about it. But he looked like he liked me, and he asked me for enough dates to make me believe him.
Within a year, they were married. Because Albert was too shy for a church wedding, they went to the pastor of the Methodist church in the neighboring town of North, who married them at his house. The pastor's wife was the witness, as were a group of Boy Scouts who were meeting behind the house at the time. Their first year of marriage was a rough one. Annie contracted typhoid fever and was very sick for a long time. 4 months after they were married, the stock market crashed and the country spiraled into the Great Depression. Albert's father had co-signed on a large loan for a friend of his who defaulted on the loan. Albert and his brother Mike had to pay that loan off. Many of those insured by A.C. Watson & Company Insurance could no longer pay their premiums. Albert and Mike, rather than letting their friends and family lapse on their insurance coverage, paid the premiums out of the company's reserves for as long as they could, but eventually the company went out of business. About 10 months into their marriage, Annie's mother had a debilitating stroke. Annie and Albert moved into Hattie's house for a year to care for her. Hattie, having always been very active, was now confined to a bed or wheelchair. She remarked that one day she would walk again, but it would be on streets paved with gold. A few weeks before her death, the pastor of Limestone Methodist Church came by to visit and administer communion to her. She stated that it would be the last time she would partake of the sacraments, and that next time she would be dining at the Lord's table. At her funeral, people remarked how young she looked, saying that being released from all her pains and anguish had removed years from her appearance. Albert and Annie then moved to the Watson farm. Albert's mother, Maggie, gave them a $20 gold piece and a diamond to help them out. They used the $20 gold piece to buy some chicks and chicken feed to start a chicken and egg business. They never sold the diamond, and years later gave it to their son to give to his fiancée as an engagement ring. Annie and Albert worked together a lot on the farm. One friend said they were the side-by-sidest couple he'd ever known. In 1933, Annie went with her brother, sister, and cousin to the World's Fair in Chicago. Albert stayed home to tend to the farm. It was the first time they had been apart since they married 4 years earlier. It was also the first time she had left the South and seen such a large city. She marveled at the changing landscapes as they drove. In Chicago, they went to the Adler Planetarium, which was the only one in the United States and one of only a few in the world. In 1936, they had their first child, Margaret Moss Watson, named for Albert's mother. A few years later, they moved into the old Inabnet house and established Seldom Rest Farms. Here they grew cotton, oats, rye, wheat, and soybeans. They also raised cows, hogs, and chickens. They had a large chicken house for the collection of eggs. There was no indoor plumbing or electricity in the house, but Albert bought a pipe cutter and a threading apparatus and installed a plumbing system throughout the house that originated from a well in the yard. With the aid of hired electricians, he also added electricity to the house. Until then, there had been gas-powered lights and later Delco battery-powered lighting. In September 1941, their son, Albert Chandler Watson III, called Al, was born into their family. 3 months later, the United States entered World War II. Annie, Albert, and others in the community were involved in civil defense. They were assigned times when they were to watch for enemy aircraft. There were air raid drills, and everyone had window darkening shades. Many everyday goods were rationed throughout the course of the war. About 21 boys from Limestone Church went to fight, and there were always many people in attendance at the Wednesday evening prayer services during the war. All the boys survived and returned home. Near the end of the war, there was a polio epidemic. Annie and her 2 children traveled 175 miles into the mountains and stayed for a month to avoid infection. Albert stayed back to tend to the farm, but commuted several times by train to visit them. After the war, life returned to normal. Albert continued farming, but also had several short-term jobs to supplement the family's income. He worked as a school bus driver, fertilizer salesman, radio announcer, and bookkeeper. He also helped several neighbors with their tax returns, but never charged them for that service. When he was 49 years old, he had an attack of angina while herding hogs into a truck. His heart disease forced him to quit active farming in 1957. Instead, he converted some of his farm fields to timberland and rented out the rest to other farmers. He and Annie continued to have a small garden to provide for much of their food needs, and they maintained a smaller egg production business. Annie had been the Limestone Methodist Church pianist for several years, and when the church got an organ, she then became the organist as well. Albert ordered an identical organ for her to have at the house. Annie taught piano, organ, and guitar lessons. She also played at many community events and at horse shows throughout the state. A truck would be sent to the house to pick up her organ and haul it to the horse shows. During several Christmas seasons, Annie volunteered to bring her organ to the biggest department store in town and arranged for local organists to take turns playing holiday music as her way of sharing her gifts of music with the community. Both Annie and Albert taught Sunday school, and for a time, Albert was the Sunday school superintendent. Annie was very involved in teaching and leading activities at Vacation Bible School each summer. Albert loved growing various plants around the yard and in his gardens, and was a member of the Orangeburg Men's Garden Club. At the Camellia Society's flower show, he asked some of the prize-winning growers for cuttings which would have otherwise been discarded. He carefully trimmed and rooted these, and eventually landscaped his yard with beautiful camellia bushes that have grown large and still bloom each year to the delight of passers-by. Albert also loved fishing. He stocked the old mill pond on Annie's land with bass and bluegill. He hired bulldozers to make 3 more ponds as well. He built several small boats for fishing on these ponds, but he also built larger boats, including a 21-foot cabin cruiser for family outings at local lakes and for use in the ocean. The whole family helped cover the hull of that boat with fiberglass fabric. Albert renovated an old camping trailer that he, Annie, Margaret Moss, and Al would camp in at Myrtle Beach for several weeks in the summers. Both Margaret Moss and Al graduated from college, married, and had children. Annie and Albert were loving grandparents to 5 grandchildren. In 1961, Annie took a bus trip by herself to visit Margaret Moss, who lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, with her husband and daughter. Her trip was severely delayed due to civil rights demonstrators known as the Freedom Riders. Their demonstrations, an important part of the civil rights movement, challenged the local customs that enforced Jim Crow laws in the South, even though federal laws had outlawed racial segregation on interstate buses. Freedom Riders crisscrossed the South and suffered beatings and abuse along the way. In 1965, and in their 60s, Annie and Albert went on an extended car trip through much of the United States with their son Al and his wife Patricia. They went as far north as Niagara Falls, and west to Los Angeles and the Pacific Ocean. Annie retired from teaching music at 67 after a fall that resulted in 2 broken vertebrae in her back. That injury caused her pain for the rest of her life, but she remained active in the music club and as the Limestone Methodist Church organist, a role that she maintained for 39 years. She described it as a privilege and a pleasure to serve in that way. The church honored her with Annie Culler Watson Day and a plaque in her honor. Albert joined the Ham Radio Club and got his radio license at the age of 70. Albert lived to be 78 years old. Annie lived to be 83. She died in 1988, which was 208 years after her grandfather Jacob Culler was born. Albert was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, and Annie a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. They were each descended from at least 6 people who fought for America's independence. Annie and Albert were both very proud of their families' histories. They appreciated the courage, conviction, and commitment their ancestors made in raising their children to be good, strong, and caring people. Annie and Albert's ancestors came together and formed a new community that successfully survived as a town in an area that would become a state in a newly formed nation.
I know our first ancestors had to be brave people to come over here.
They were isolated from the other communities. It was a long distance from the different towns, and they had those church records. That kind of paints a picture of a community of caring, and you would see the names pop up at the baptisms and the marriages and the mention at the funerals and one thing and another, the different ones that were the witnesses, and you felt like they all had these good friends, and they shared this common faith, and they shared the common problems and the struggles, and they helped each other out and formed a strong bonds of community.
It was a community of sharing. They helped each other out. It's just been like that. It's just been like that ever since 1735.
It sounded like a strong family with a lot of strong bonds, and as we grew up and knew all the aunts and uncles, and I can't remember either one of the grandparents, but I could feel like this was a great family and I was privileged to be a part of it.
Many of them have remained on the same land for nearly 300 years. Others have moved and now populate all areas of the country. Today, there are thousands of Americans who share common ancestors, and even more who have similar histories.
I tell you, this country of the United States, we are an unusual country. We've got more pioneers here. But that's the reason I think our country is great today. It's because of our pioneering spirit. We still have that. We are different. We are different from all the other countries in the world.
This family, like many others across this unique nation, has had a rich history. However, the story is not yet finished. Each new generation is building upon the legacy of those that came before them, and continue to develop and shape communities throughout the country.
Well, I learned getting on the keys when I was about 16 years old. And my grandchildren always seemed to want me to play it. But now that my fingers are not as nimble as they used to be, I will probably make a lot of mistakes, but I hope you will forgive me.